Hey guys, we are finally wrapping up our coverage of Survivor 45 with a review of the season, where I'll give my personal thoughts on Survivor 45, and I thought this was a pretty good season. I mean, I feel like it was largely helped by the 90-minute episodes that really gave the show more time to flesh out the characters and to break down some of the twists, and I feel like for the most part, it was an improvement over 44 in a lot of ways. But as usual with my reviews, I like to break them down into 4 sections. Those being the cast, the production, the editing, and the gameplay. And let's waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So first up, we have the cast, and I feel like this cast in a lot of ways feels in line with the rest of the new era. I feel like there weren't too many exceptional characters, especially compared to 44, but there were still some pretty interesting figures nonetheless, and I guess we can just go through them in their boot order. Where first up we have Hannah Rose, and I feel like she kind of brought nothing to the season, and I feel like that's kind of expected given that she quit and they didn't really want to prop her up too much. Though I feel like even outside that, a lot of her focus was on the fact that she was struggling in the elements and she had quit smoking. And a lot of it kind of reminded me of Zayd Knight, though obviously a much less active player in the game and not as interesting to watch on the TV screen, but still, she was there. Then we have Brandon, who I found to be a much more interesting figure, where obviously he came into the season as a big super fan and someone that you would expect to have this journey at it, given how much he talked about his anxiety and how much game knowledge he had, only for him to completely flame out due to his inability to do anything in challenges, which I thought was an interesting way for him to go. It's sort of a reminder that even in this hyper-strategic era, that physical strength still matters to a degree, especially when you're on a tribe as terrible as Lulu. And I'm sure people like Jeff are pretty happy to see this outcome happen, as they feel vindicated that the new era has successfully stripped people down and that it's no joke to be out here on Survivor. So I did find that interesting, but at the end of the day, I still think it's a shame to lose Brandon as early as we did. Then we have Saia, who was a much better player than I expected, where she dominated Lulu early on, and I feel like she got pretty unlucky that Lulu ended up being as bad of a tribe as they were, as it really ruined her position moving forward. And while I criticize her move to target Caleb at the third tribal, I still feel like had she not been on as bad of a tribe physically as Lulu, she probably makes the merge and she probably could have had potential moving forward. But even so, I found her downfall pretty fun, where obviously she throws the idol into the fire to retrieve it from the wax, and then she later sacrifices her vote, thinking that she's safe, only for her to be taken out. I feel like it was a pretty glorious downfall for her, so while I do feel bad for her in the sense that she was taken out early, at least she had a fun boot round. Then we have Shawn Edwards, who was mostly a nothing figure on the show, and I feel like that made him pretty unlikely to win based off the edit. Though I will say he kind of stood out for me for other reasons, like the fact that one of my Discord users, Bryce, was really obsessed with him, and he would constantly DM me asking me to mention him in my videos, and that he wanted me to let everyone know that he was Shawn's biggest fan. So he did kind of stand out to me that way, but I find his boot round very weird, where obviously he managed to turn a bad swap into a good situation for him, only for him to quit the game as he thought he had no path forward, which was kind of underwhelming at the end of the day, especially with how big of a super fan he was. Though I will say Jeff's reaction to him quitting was pretty funny, where you could very clearly tell that he was pissed that this was happening yet again, but still, it was a pretty fun moment there. Then we have Brando, who was just kind of there. I feel like he didn't really bring much to me, so I don't have much to say on him. Then we have Maya, who admittedly was also mostly nothing on the show. I feel like she didn't really stick out to me too much. Though kind of similar to Shawn, she kind of stood out for outside of the game reasons, where it turns out that one of my coworkers actually knew Maya growing up, and that was actually something that we would use to talk about Survivor, even though they weren't much of a Survivor fan themselves. But outside of that, I mean, Maya didn't really bring much to me, and I don't have much to say about her. Then we have Sefue, who ended up being one of the more under-edited characters on the season, despite him being this pretty big personality and someone who could have brought a lot of entertainment to the season. And I feel like this is partially due to the show not wanting us to feel too bad for him, considering he is a pre-juror. But at the end of the day, I still feel bad that he didn't make jury, considering that was something he really wanted during his boot episode. But still, I'm kind of disappointed he didn't get more to do on the show. Then we have Caleb, who ended up being one of the bigger characters on the season, and I did enjoy him to a degree, with him being one of the more hyper-strategic players on here, and I'm kind of glad we got plenty of focus from him, though considering how big of a threat he was, it sort of made sense why he was taken out when he was, though it was also funny seeing a lot of people online claiming that he was the winner for a lot of the season, even though he pretty clearly had this big player edit, and was probably pretty destined to be taken out. Then we have Kelly, who didn't do too much for me on the show, although I did find her constant talk about her options and being the swing vote kind of funny, though at the end of the day, she wasn't one of the bigger characters for me. Then we have Kendra, who I'm admittedly kind of mixed about, where I didn't care too much for her astrology focus and her kooky personality too much. Though, kind of like Sefue, she was also kind of under-edited, where despite her having a solid first 2 episodes, she kind of just faded into the background for a lot of the pre-merge, and again, she kind of only came up when it was necessary, and it really wasn't until her boot round where she got more of a focus, though even then, I figured she probably wasn't winning by that point. So again, she was kind of there for me, but not one of my favorites. Then we have Bruce, who is obviously one of the more interesting characters on the season, and while he ended up being a pretty terrible player, he was still kind of fun to watch on the show, where he talked about wanting to be the uncle, only for him to be more like the dad at the end of it. It was a lot of fun seeing a lot of the drama that he caused, particularly with Coutura being upset by him. And I also find his downfall pretty interesting, where obviously he was shown on the show to be weighing down a lot of the bellows, such as Kelly and later Kendra. And then obviously he gets taken out with an idol in his pocket, which is always fun. So again, I did like Bruce quite a bit, even though he probably would be pretty annoying to live with on the island. Then we have Emily, who is probably the main character of the season, and definitely one of the bigger sources of entertainment for me, where obviously she has this pretty big journey edit throughout the season, where after she was almost the first boot, she obviously gets a lot of focus during the pre-merge, and again, it's pretty fun seeing her eventually evolve into this pretty big player, and while she says at the moment that she wouldn't play again, I wouldn't be opposed to Emily returning at some point, so I feel like she was one of the highlights of the season for me. Then we have Drew, who was another pretty big character on the season, and while he does fill this nerd archetype we've seen before, I feel like he comes off more as this Napoleon Dynamite style figure versus a straight up know-it-all as we saw with Carson. But still, he was pretty fun to watch in the season, even though I feel like it was very unlikely he was going to win for a lot of it, considering how big his edit was. Then we have Julie, who also didn't really do much for me, where even though she got a pretty consistent presence, getting at least one confessional in every episode, I also think a lot of her content lacked depth to it, where outside her talking about being a lawyer in episode 1 and hiding that fact, I feel like we don't really get to know Julie super well outside of her being the mom of the season. And obviously that played into her game, where obviously by the end she was very well liked, and there was a lot of talk about her being a big jury thread. But at the end of the day, I feel like she didn't really do much for me, and I feel like out of the Reap before, she was probably the least interesting character of that 4. Then we have Coutura, who ends up having a really strange edit during the season, where she gets this pretty perfect premiere in episode 1 that made her number 1 on my episode 1 power ranking, but then her content very quickly devolves into her talking about Bruce all the time and her constantly bashing on Bruce. And while she is presented on the show as being right, as we later see other people pick up on Bruce being annoying, I did find some of it to be pretty annoying, and I found it to be kind of mean as well, to where by the end of it, I felt like it was just too much for it to really turn into a win. Though I will say that after Bruce left, her content did turn around to a degree, where she ends up talking about her really insane background, having grown up in this cult and having run away from it, only for her to learn that she's gay. Again, a really insane backstory there, but I feel like her Bruce bashing that defined so much of the season just felt way too cartoonish in my eyes, to where I didn't really see her as a contender by the end of it. Then we have Jake, who, as I said in my player ranking, I just feel bad for. I mean, he comes off as a very likable figure, and he has a pretty good backstory, having originally been overweight, only for him to turn his life around. Him becoming a lawyer is all pretty good, and him wanting to move out of his grandma's house is all pretty admirable, and you can clearly tell that he's a big fan of the show as well, where I really like the way that he talks about the game in his confessionals and in his exit interviews. Again, you can clearly tell that he was aware of what was happening in the game. The problem is that everything went wrong for him during the season, where time after time he's out of the loop on plans. He's very rarely in control for a lot of the game. And I also feel like he's someone that struggles to command respect during a lot of the season, where even though people seem to like him, I feel like a lot of people also just pity him for a lot of it, where it comes off in the final tribal, where people are giving him chances to talk, even though he doesn't have much of a chance of winning. It even comes off during the challenges, where the way that Jeff kind of scolds him a lot due to him not following the instructions, not to mention DQing him at the final 4 after he breaks the immunity challenge. I feel like all this just kind of shows to me that people just didn't take him that seriously during a lot of the game. And I feel like that also reflects in his inability to get anyone on his side during a lot of the season and obviously everything going wrong for him. So while he's someone whose game that I criticize a good amount in the player ranking, he is someone that I like a lot and he's someone that I very much sympathize with considering everything that goes wrong for him. Then we have Austin, who, while not my favorite character, still had some fun moments like the whole sandwich thing during the journey and him using that to justify getting rid of J Maya later on. I did find that kind of funny. And while I didn't really care too much for a showmance with Dee by the end of it, it did lead to some interesting parallels comparing themselves to Rob and Amber, which was good foreshadowing for them getting to the end together. And in general, I find that situation kind of weird, but again, not my favorite character. And finally, we have Dee, the winner of the season, who definitely had some bum moments here and there. And while she definitely came off as mean-spirited at points, with her talking about Shawn being at the bottom and her insisting that she's going to get her way, I feel like the show never presented it as a negative for her, as I feel like it just showed her like just getting her way at the end of the day. So obviously there's that. And while there were things I didn't care for as much, like her showmance with Austin and her constant talk about her family, she still had some fun moments here and there, like her talking about her big toe, which became a big moment later in the season. And I still find her a mostly satisfying winner, at least from an entertainment perspective. Next, let's move on to production, which is obviously a fun topic to talk about with the new era. And while it has some of the same annoyances I have with the new era, I feel like it doesn't have the same lows as 44 had, particularly in that early post-merge. Now, in terms of new additions, I feel like the main one to turn to is the tribe swap, where they actually had a proper tribe swap on this season, as opposed to what they did on 44, where it was just one person going over. And admittedly, while the swap didn't play out in the most interesting way, where two of the tribes were essentially just 4-1 majorities from original groups, we still had at least a 2-2-1 situation on the third tribe that we got to see play out when they went to tribal, so at least we got that. And obviously the other big addition is the return of the Survivor auction after 15 seasons, and obviously this was pretty hyped up during the preseason, and while it wasn't the thing I was looking forward to the most, I am glad they at least brought it back and tried to retool it. Now, with that said, I feel like the actual format itself was pretty flawed, where they had this whole thing where people were scrambling to get their own money early on, leaving people with an unequal amount of money. And while I understand their intent of getting rid of all the advantages so that people actually care about the food, I feel like they really shoot themselves in the foot by leaving people with an unequal amount of money to begin with, and also having this whole wrinkle of whoever has the most money left at the end of it will lose their vote, as it basically just turned the auction into whoever has the most amount of money just cashes out right away, kind of going all in so that no one else can get it, and in turn just going down the line and who did well in getting money before the auction. In this game of hot potato just took away all the suspense that comes with people bidding and people actually caring about what the food is and just passing the buck on to the next person. And I think the other thing is that since they do this at the final 10 by taking away someone's vote, it takes away the potential for there to be a rock draw, which I found pretty disappointing there. And while I hope they bring back the auction in the future, I hope they really change it, as I feel like the current format of the auction is a pretty bad middle ground between having the auction have meaningful game implications and having it be there purely for the characters and for the entertainment of it all. We also had the Beware advantage returning after not being on 44, and they obviously changed the actual tasks again. But interestingly, they actually have each tribe get a different task for unlocking the Beware advantage. We obviously see the Rebas having to solve this puzzle and digging through their camp, while the Lulus have their idol trapped in wax that they had to burn with their fire, which is pretty bad considering that the Lulus never get fire due to them losing every challenge. And again, while I understand the need to make each challenge different so that we're not just seeing the same thing over and over again, I also think it leads to some tribes having a pretty unfair advantage in terms of unlocking the Beware advantage. And while the wax led to a very fun moment at the Sabaya tribal where she obviously throws into the fire to melt the wax there, I still think it was a pretty poor decision from a game perspective, as it leads to some tribes being in a much worse spot to actually get their idol compared to others. We also have the amulets returning after being on 42, and again, I find them to be mostly alright. It obviously led to some fun there with Austin wanting to get revenge for not being able to have his sandwich, and obviously with him having an amulet, it makes him confident to give his idol over to Julie that she later uses at the final 7 to idol Emily out. So again, there was some fun to be had, but at the end of the day, I don't feel like they had too big of an impact on the season. And aside from that, I feel like this season was obviously more of the same when it comes to the new era, where we have a lot of the same gimmicks going on. We also had the return of the On Fire podcast with Jeff Probst, which ended up featuring Rick Devens as the host for a lot of it, where a lot of it was just them recapping the episodes while Jeff occasionally weighs in on what's happening. And for the most part, I don't have as much to say about the On Fire podcast. I felt more the same in terms of how Jeff sees Survivor, though I will also say it was funny seeing him dunking on Adam Klein early on this season, where if you don't know, Adam Klein runs a one-on-one coaching service for navigating the Survivor casting process, and it turns out that several people on the 45 cast used this coaching service to help get on the show, and Jeff ended up getting really mad when all this came to light, and he got super defensive on the podcast about it, claiming that these people would have gone on regardless and that you can't game the system to get on the show. So I did find that pretty funny. But on the whole, while there were definitely some issues with the production on this season, I didn't find it as egregious as other seasons of the new era. Then we have the editing, which is obviously a pretty notable feature on this season, considering that for the first time, the entire season was 90-minute episodes, upgraded from the 60-minute episodes that we saw before. And obviously a lot of this was due to the writer's strikes that happened during the summer, though obviously this is something that fans had demanded for a while. And for the most part, I feel like it really helped the season out, where I feel like through the added runtime, it gave us more time to get to know these people and for the show to properly explain what was happening in the game. And I feel like that mostly led to the season being a better viewing experience on the whole. I also feel like the season was a continuation of this trend we saw in 44 and to a degree with 43, where the show is trending towards being more goofy and not being afraid to paint people as villains and to really dunk on people when it feels like it. And I feel like that's really exemplified with the Guys Night scene, which is still one of the craziest scenes to ever happen on Survivor US, with them using pop music and really feels like something that would not have happened on older seasons of the show. Now, I will say that with the 90-minute format, there was definitely some consideration for how this would impact the edgic of the show, as obviously with more time for more people, it obviously impacts the value that someone's screen time has in terms of whether they are a contender. And I feel like you also have the fact that this is an odd number season, which going by recent history is usually an indication that this season would have a less conventional edit and a less predictable outcome, at least at the time you're watching it, where we saw 41 and 43 having these less predictable outcomes and having decoy winners along the way, while the even number seasons in 42 and 44 tended to have more straightforward rides by the end of it. But despite these factors, I actually found my Edgic power rankings on this season to be more similar to that of 44 than on 43, where I feel like by the end of it, I felt pretty confident about what was going to happen, which I wasn't expecting coming into it. Where early on, I found myself higher on the Bella women as they got a lot of the more complex content in the premiere, but it wasn't long before they started to fall off as their content kind of fell off a cliff, which made me confused over why they were getting all this content if they weren't serious contenders. And then my focus started to shift to Emily and Dee, where from episode 3 on, they were essentially my top 2 for the rest of the season, kind of going back and forth for that number 1 spot. And a lot of it felt similar to on 44, where I felt like I was going back and forth between Jam Jam and Carolyn for a lot of it. Though I will say that they were in top contention for different reasons, where Emily was in the top 2 due to her being this bigger character, where she had this massive turnaround after the premiere and she started to be taken more seriously. We saw her start to grow, and while that was obviously good enough to have her in top contention, I was questioning it a lot due to this feeling too much like a journey edit and whether she would eventually have a downfall, which obviously she eventually did. While Dee was getting all this random content early on, where a lot of it felt unnecessary, like she would talk about her big toe in episode 2. Even in the premiere, while she was dunking on Sefue, she expanded upon that to talk about her family and how back home she would be a fireball, but she has to keep it in. And a lot of it felt like this more traditional winner edit in my eyes, which is a big reason she was in contention as well. But I was also questioning that as I wondered whether she would have a drop off in the post merge that would explain why she would be a losing finalist. And plus, I feel like her edit during some of the post merge episodes weren't great, but it really wasn't until the final 7 that she really popped off to me, where she got all the credit for taking out Emily due to her telling Julie about the plan. I feel like that was expanded upon further in the following episode, where she got this contrast between her like doing what's best for her game while Austin was unwilling to do that, relying more so on his emotions. And while the finale was a bit questionable, where obviously she kind of contradicts herself by her not wanting to vote out Julie, I feel like by that point she was by far the biggest contender to win, as everyone else's edits was way too flawed and had too many holes in them, to where I feel like Dee was clearly the winner by the end of it. And I know that the Edit community was kind of unwilling to accept this towards the end, where even coming to the finale week, I was seeing all these posts online about how Jake still had a path to a win, how Coutura still had a path to a win. And while I understood some of their arguments, I just completely disagree with them. I felt like Dee was clearly set up to win from this point on, and she did. So on the whole, I find the editing of the season to be pretty interesting. It definitely made for a more worthwhile experience due to it being 90 minutes. And while the Edgic wasn't as chaotic as other seasons, I still found it to be mostly coherent and a clear reminder that Edgic isn't dead. And finally, we have the gameplay, which I also found to be pretty fun across the season. There were definitely some fun rounds along the way, and while it wasn't the most dynamic season in the world, there were still some flashes of interesting moments here. Where while we get off to a pretty slow start, we get to the Saia tribal, which was a lot of fun, where Saia tried to blindside Caleb, someone that she was relatively close to, only for Emily to tell Caleb about the plan, and they're able to flip it on Saia instead after Saia doesn't use her idol, which is pretty fun. We then get to the post swap, which obviously has some interesting moments here, like Maya and Shawn being able to flip the votes, only for Shawn to quit the game. That was kind of weird. We had a 2-2-1 swap tribal where we had a swing vote, and while that outcome was pretty predictable, I still found that to be kind of interesting, kind of different from these unanimous votes we see a lot in the pre-merge New Era tribals. I also thought the Maya tribal was a lot of fun, where Caleb uses his shot in the dark, negates all the votes, breaks the record for most votes negated at a tribal with 11, and obviously it's a no votes tribal where they had to go to a revote. That's a lot of fun. You also had the Kelly tribal, which was a lot of fun. Seeing the bells completely fracture and also seeing Kelly's reaction after being blindsided, she just felt completely gutted there, which was pretty interesting. You also have the Bruce tribal, which is good, where Bruce gets blindsided with an idol in his pocket. That's fun. I also thought the Emily tribal was good, where we see Dee telling Julie about the plan. She plays her idol, negating all the votes with Julie casting a soul vote to evict. That's good. You also had the Final Five tribal, which was really insane. Definitely one of the best tribals to happen this late in the game, where obviously it becomes a 2-to-1-to-1 vote, where we have an idol being played and Couture flipping her vote at the last moment, which led to some great reactions. We even get the final tribal, where for the first time in the new era, it is not a 7-to-1 vote, where Austin actually managed to get 3 votes and flips Kendra's vote in the middle of final tribal, which is pretty good. But also you have Dee revealing to the jury that she was the one to tell Julie about the plan at the final 7, which is obviously pretty good. And I guess we can talk about Dee as a winner, where I feel like she played an extremely dominant game for the most part, being in the core of the majority for so much of the game. She's obviously the catalyst for the Emily blindside at the final 7, where she takes out a pretty big player in the game and forcing Austin to have to work with her moving forward. And she's able to pull this off without taking much heat for it, where she doesn't become that big of a threat afterwards. Now, I will say the final 5 round is really bad, where obviously she comes very close to going home, basically has to rely on Couture flipping her vote at the last moment, and even outside that, having to rely on Austin voting for Julie after he struggled to vote for her for much of the day. So again, a lot of luck-based circumstances for how she survived that round. And also, she does lose Kendra's vote during Final Tribal, which I don't love, resulting in her only winning in a 5-3 vote. But at the end of the day, she still played a very dominant game, and I'd say she's the best winner of the new era by a good amount. Where while I think Jam Jam also played a solid game, I feel like he was targeted at more points compared to Dee, plus he wanted to take Carson to the end in a spot where Carson probably beats him. I feel like Dee was in a much better spot to actually win the game, and she had a pretty smooth ride to getting there, where she obviously wins final immunity, but even if she didn't, Austin also would have saved her had he won final immunity, which seemed pretty likely. So on the whole, I find Dee's game really impressive, and I think even with her flaws, she's still one of the best players of the new era in my eyes. But there we go, that will do it for this week's video, along with my coverage of Survivor 45. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now obviously I have some end of the year stuff coming, such as my awards that'll be coming out at the end of the year, and even beyond that there's some new shows coming out in the new year, such as Traders and Australian Survivor, so you can look forward to all of that. I'm also on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.